In this lesson, I would like to do some improvements in regards to timeline items module. So when we open up the application, state of the application is loaded from the local storage, and then we call this initialize timeline items function to initialize timeline items reactive variable. So let's take a look what is going on inside of this function. As we can see in here, we're calling a couple of additional functions such as sync idle seconds as well as reset timeline items, and both of these functions take array of timeline items as the first parameter. But this is not necessary because we have already previously initialized timeline items reactive variable, so we can get access to timeline items array directly within these functions. And also, on the first line of this function, we are searching for the active timeline item object, but there is no need, because we already have active timeline item computed property, which we can use to get access to active timeline item. And as for reset timeline items function, here we are also taking array of timeline items as the first parameter and then iterating over this array. But in fact, there is no need to do it because, as we can see in here, before calling reset timeline items function, we are already initializing timeline items reactive variable with the data that we have fetched from local storage. So now we're going to do some refactoring in here by removing unnecessary parameters. Let's start with sync idle seconds function. I'm going to remove the first parameter from here, as well as declaration of this parameter. And to get access to timeline items array in this function, we can use timeline items reactive variable like so. But as was mentioned previously, this line is not needed because we already have active timeline item computed property. So let's use this computed property right here. Also, the following line is basically doing an update of an active timeline item, but previously in this course we have created function to update timeline item objects. This function is called update timeline item, so let's call it in here. As the first parameter, it accepts that timeline item object we need to update, and as the second argument, it accepts array of overridden fields we have to update. So in here we're basically going to add additional amount of seconds to existing amount of activity seconds of this timeline item object. Let's remove commented code, and as for this conditional, it's not actually necessary, because if we'll take a look at initialize timeline items function, in here we are already checking if we have active timeline item, so there is no need to do it again inside sync idle seconds function. I'm gonna get rid of this conditional. And just because we are mutating existing object from timeline items array by calling update timeline item function, we don't actually need to return mutated object. So let's remove this return statement as well as this assignment, because original timeline items array is already mutated by calling sync idle seconds function. And just as a reminder, update timeline item function looks like this. It just uses method assign to update timeline item object. So now back to reset timeline items function. We're going to do pretty much the same steps by removing this assignment as well as the first parameter. And inside this function, instead of receiving timeline items array as the first parameter, let's reference timeline items reactive variable. And instead of calling method map, we're gonna use for each in this case, because we're going to mutate timeline item objects directly by calling our function update timeline item. So in this case, we are updating two fields activity seconds and is active. Let's specify those in here. There is no need to return anything from this function, and since this function is private, we can remove this export keyword. So again, let's take a look at initialize timeline items function, and before calling functions sync idle seconds or reset timeline items, initially we are initializing reactive variable timeline items with all the data that we have fetched from the local storage, and then those functions will operate on this reactive array. And one final touch to do in this lesson is move reset timeline items function closer to the rest of private functions. And with that, we can finish this lesson and continue development in the next one.